Okay, I am John McCallum. I'm in the history department, and I work in 20th century stuff, so areas where Mike Nichols is primary source material for me. And I should start by thanking Kelly and David and Bart and everyone for organizing this, and the division for supporting the research that let me get to this point. My project, to put it in kind of the most stripped down simple terms, is about large-scale lethal state violence and about moral reactions by democratic societies, moral sentiments and moral sensibilities in democratic societies responding to large-scale state violence. And the project is an American history in the 20th century, is about how Americans came to grips ethically with sustained mass killing in the course of World War II and Korea and Vietnam. My archive is in the 1940s. My focus is really on World War II, but analytically I'm interested in kind of a short American century between 1941 and 1973. So the problem is figuring out kind of those ethical sensibilities. And one of the ways that I like to put it when I'm talking to people who don't work really in the US international history field is it's not about formal ethical justifications. It's not about just war theory. It's about waking up for 4 years in the course of the 1940s. You open the morning paper, and the news that a ship is burning at sea or that an airplane has been shot down full of people and crashed somewhere is good news. That's a different ethical landscape than when that's not the case. So I kind of try to look in the 1940s in a lot of different state archives, a lot of different public, sort of public culture things to figure out how people are thinking through these moral problems. I'm not going to answer that question today. I'm not really going to explain my conclusions, but kind of reformulate the problem by thinking about the American century, Henry Luce's article in 1941. This is a really famous editorial that's written right as the United States is considering the Lend-Lease bill, as the United States is moving towards some kind of intervention in World War II. France has fallen, the war hasn't begun in the Soviet Union yet, but it's clear that the United States is moving towards something. And Henry Luce, who's the editor and publisher of Life magazine, Time magazine, one of the most powerful and important public voices in the United States at the time, decides that he's going to resolve our problems. He's going to figure out the course for the country to take. And he goes big. He winds up really articulating a geopolitical vision for the United States for the rest of the century. And it's one that has political economic ramifications. It looks at the longue durée of American rise and eclipsing European power, and it looks at US relations with East Asia. He has an enormous kind of vision of what the American century could be. But he doesn't start with political economy. He doesn't start with world order. He starts by talking about the mood of the American people. This is the first sentence of his article. We Americans are unhappy. We are not happy about America. We are not happy about ourselves in relation to America. We are nervous or gloomy or apathetic. So he's interested in mood in the first place, and the contrast with the American mood is the mood across the Atlantic Ocean under the Blitz. London is being bombed, London is burning, and he says the British people are profoundly calm. There seems to be a complete absence of nervousness. It seems as though all of the neuroses of modern life had vanished from England. So right off the bat, what Luce is doing is suggesting that war resolves some kind of problem of mood and sensibility and sentiment for the United States, that moving towards war would solve a spiritual problem in the country. And he tells us 5 times in the course of the article that we are in the war already. A little bit of dissonance here because he's saying we need to move towards war in order to resolve this problem, but he's saying that we're already there. And he underlines this further when he writes a memoir in the course of the 1960s. He's a firm proponent of American intervention in Vietnam, and recalling in the 1960s what he had done in the American century, he says that article was a declaration of war. That saying the United States was in the war was sort of demanding that we should be. This is time for involvement. Now, you could draw a really tidy line from 1941 through the 1960s, through the violence of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam with this kind of link. But there's a big kink in that. There's a problem in that Luce had not called for war in that 1941 article in the American century. And you can see that in his qualifications. He tells us, of course, we're not technically at war. We're not painfully at war. We may never have to experience the full hell that war can be. And my favorite bit, he contemplates the possibility that the embassy could stay open in Berlin, that the United States could have diplomatic relations with Germany. So there's a problem here in terms of thinking about war and peace in this article and what he's really calling for. What are liberal internationalists thinking about when they think about war in 1941? So what did the American century mean? We could read the text more carefully, we could go into Henry Luce's biography, and we could think about that. But what I did here, and this is just kind of getting into my problem of thinking about the ethics of violence in this period, was to turn to the Henry Luce papers in the Library of Congress and look at a collection of about 500 letters that he received in response to this article in 1941. The dates are really interesting. He received the letters in between publication in February and the point where Franklin Roosevelt declares an unlimited state of national emergency, and we begin shooting on sight German ships in the Atlantic that are interfering with convoys. Now, this period is really an important one in terms of American policy formation and whatnot. And it's interesting that Luce or Life magazine stopped collecting the letters at this point. Obviously, more were coming in, but that's the archive we have. It made a profound impression on a lot of people. This illustration is of someone, I don't know if you can read the inscription, to Henry R. Luce. This is one of a number of writers who sent their personal photograph with their letters and said, Henry Luce should think about me in the course of his day. They weren't networking, really. They weren't people who seemed like they wanted to get anything out of him particularly, but they felt a connection to this article. A sample of things that people wrote. They said that that editorial felt like a rope tossed overboard to a man drowning in a sea of confusion. After years of stumbling in the semi-darkness, there appeared a light in the distance. I'm quoting from the most positive letters, but they were overwhelmingly positive, and very, very often you saw statements like this, that the editorial had been a revelation. The scales had dropped from our eyes. Now we can see the world clearly, thanks to Henry Luce. I liked this one person. A lot of people talked about how could we get this out here to other people? People became evangelists of the American century. The last quote here, have you considered the possibility of reaching those incoherent millions who don't read Life? People wanted to circulate this. And I want to go through a couple of the responses, a number of responses for the bulk of the rest of this talk that kind of give us a fine-grained sense of how people were thinking about what Luce had said and about war and peace in this period. So the first letter is from Joe Boyer of Central Valley, California. He was a laborer who worked on dams in the far west throughout the entire Great Depression, which is already right there an interesting connection to Luce and Luce's project. Margaret Bourke-White's famous photographs of American dams in the Depression period were on the cover of the first issue of Life magazine. Rockwell Kent, who Joe Boyer references, was frequently featured his illustrations in Life magazine. And Boyer had one of the very strongest reactions to this article. He thought that this was something that deserved almost a devotional kind of response. He said that he'd preserve the editorial with Leaves of Grass and the Rockwell Kent illustrations. So here's someone who, in terms of his immediate response, but also his background and the way that he thinks of American progress in the world, is as close to Henry Luce as you can possibly get. Now, to think about war here, Boyer goes on at the end of his letter to write, there is a larger liberty. He's talked about Americans preserving and expanding liberty. There is a larger liberty understood best today by Gandhi and Kagala, and there is a nonviolent, loving way to overcome evil with good, the only way in which progress and peace for the greatest number eventually can be attained. Even Napoleon realized this before he died. If you're making strategic plans for war in the War Department, the Navy Department, or Whitehall, this should give you pause, right? I mean, when you think about how this worker in California is responding to the American century, he's enthusiastically a proponent of what Luce is saying for American hegemony and liberty in the world, and he's also effectively a pacifist. Now, very often things get lost in translation between the East Coast and the West Coast. Maybe this is some nut from California. But we can say that Carlton Sherwood, who is the vice president of a financial firm just a few floors away from Henry Luce in Rockefeller Center, wrote a letter saying he had just lunched with Hoover, former President Herbert Hoover at the Waldorf, and he was struck by parallels between Luce's writing and Herbert Hoover's ideas. Hoover was adamantly opposed to any kind of American military intervention in the conflict, and Hoover wrote some of the most scathing revisionist histories of the war afterwards. So again, we have another person who was fully endorsing what he saw Luce as saying, but also entirely antagonistic to the idea of any kind of violence. And this comes up a lot. I mean, I pulled up these two examples, but you see this in a lot of letters. There were also people who were simply less certain about what was going on. Joseph Leahy, writing from Florida, and all of the letters I'm citing here, incidentally, are people who basically endorsed Luce. They were enthusiastic proponents of what he was saying, almost all of them. But this is another person who was a supporter, but then he paused over the issue of means. He liked Luce's ends, he wasn't sure about the means. Should we use methods like Hitler? Should we use force? Should we murder like Hitler in exerting our influence? He says no. He says this is too far. Again, basically agreeing with Luce, but this is problematic for him. And then you have another writer who, there's no envelope for him, I don't know where he comes from, E.L. Raleigh. He makes a really interesting ethical distinction when he says that murdering can only be justified in immediate self-defense. Now, Robert Maynard Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, was making an argument at this point that was relatively anti-war, but he was one of a lot of people who said formally there can be no difference between shipping weapons to the British and actually becoming involved in a war. A lot of people saw this quite differently. They saw an enormous ethical gulf between killing and fighting and dying and backing the Allies. And then, after these people who had some reservations about violence, there were a few who were just confused about what Luce had said. There was a woman who wrote from Tennessee and said, agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, but what do we actually do? It's not clear. We're going to get to an American century, but how? I don't know. Henry Dixon of Boston said rather more emphatically, would you kindly inform a constant purchaser of your magazine what the writer of the article or essay or whatever it was entitled The American Century was driving at? What was his point? It reminded me of Gertrude Stein or someone talking double talk. So there's some confusion too. And we could just say, well, maybe Luce was unclear. Maybe people were just projecting onto it whatever they wanted. But I don't think that's quite right, because there were a lot of people who did speak directly to issues of violence and conflict, and what they did was not get to questions of total war. They didn't get to anything that looked like the conflict that was being fought in Europe and in East Asia, and that the United States would shortly join. They referenced a deeper past. So we have a Frank M. from Sharon, Massachusetts, who went immediately to histories of racial expropriation and conflict, reaching way back into the past, beyond even American history. The savages wrested England from the Romans by exterminating the latter, man and woman, old and young, sick and infirm. He says this had a role to play in the past, but the time has now come for savage man to step down from the stage, taking his due applause. He was thinking about the prospective violence of total war in terms of this sort of deeper history of conflict and violence. Ruth Watson of Indianapolis, Indiana, was, again, a supporter of Luce generally, liked what he said, didn't like the New Deal, and saw the prospect of some kind of social revolution and violence against the New Deal state on the horizon, in addition to the war. And she actually went so far as to reference a long history of American conflict and her family's frontier role. And she closes by talking about a gun that's still in the family's possession and had been used to kill native inhabitants of the continent in terms of a much deeper American history of violence. These were resources people had to think about the war in 1941. But of course, the old frontier fighting methods of war was not what wound up happening in the 1940s. You have a very different kind of conflict that emerges. And to sort of repose the problem that I have here, I'm simply saying that in 1941, the time that Luce is writing this article that we can take rather directly into examinations of the American century, the moral imagination of American liberal internationalism doesn't get you here. This is Cologne in 1945. And to really think about where the state goes in the middle 1940s, you have to get at a fine-grained history of the warriors themselves. And that's where the rest of my research is headed or has been, and I don't have the answers to sort of lay out today, but that's the problem, is how do you get from 1941 and no vision of this kind of violence to Cologne in 1945? So, thank you.